I want to start by saying I never wanted trouble with my homeowners association. I bought my property because I wanted space, quiet, and the freedom to work my own land the way I saw fit. I never imagined that a disagreement over a tractor would end with me legally shutting down the only entrance to an entire subdivision. But that's exactly what happened, and I'm going to walk you through every single step of how it went down. Let me give you some background first, because context matters here. 5 years ago, my wife and I bought 11 acres on the edge of a growing subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. Our land wasn't technically inside the HOA boundary when we bought it, but the developer had left one small detail buried in the original plat maps. The main entrance road into Willow Creek Estates crossed a strip of land that belonged to my property. It was a 50-foot easement, granted decades earlier by the original farming family who owned the land before any of these houses existed. The easement allowed the subdivision to use that strip as an access road, but the underlying land, the dirt, the drainage, the shoulder, everything except the paved surface itself, was still legally mine. Nobody in the HOA ever mentioned this to me when we moved in. Nobody at the county clerk's office made a big deal out of it either. It was just a line item buried in a title report that my real estate attorney flagged during closing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured, why would it ever matter? People need a road. I have a tractor and some hay fields. We'll all get along. For 4 years, that's exactly how it went. I kept my property clean, mowed my fields, waved to my neighbors, and used my tractor to help clear snow off my end of the access road every winter without anyone asking me to. I thought I was being a good neighbor. I thought the HOA appreciated it. Then Karen Whitfield became HOA president. I want to be fair here. Not everyone named Karen is a problem, and I don't say that name to be cute. That's genuinely her name, and by the end of this story you'll understand why it fits so well. Karen Whitfield ran on a platform of protecting property values and enforcing community standards. Within her first 3 months in office, she had sent out over 40 violation notices for things like mailbox color, garden gnome placement, and, I am not exaggerating, a wind chime that was, in her words, audibly disruptive to the aesthetic tranquility of the neighborhood. I should have seen the writing on the wall. My property, while technically outside the HOA's governing boundary, was visible from the main road. And apparently, in Karen's mind, visible meant subject to her rules. It started small. A letter arrived in my mailbox, not addressed to me by name, just to the resident, informing me that my tractor, parked in my own field, was an eyesore that did not conform to community aesthetic guidelines and needed to be moved out of view or covered with an approved tarp. I laughed it off. I wasn't part of the HOA. I didn't sign their covenant. I didn't pay their dues. I called the HOA office, politely explained that my property was outside their jurisdiction, and figured that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 2 weeks later, I came home from a supply run to find my tractor gone. Not broken down, not moved, gone. My $22,000 tractor, the one I used to bale hay, plow snow, and maintain the very access road the entire subdivision depended on, had been towed. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line first because my gut reaction was that someone had stolen it. An hour later, a deputy called me back and said the tow had been authorized by the Willow Creek Estates HOA, who claimed the tractor was parked on common area land and violated their towing policy for unauthorized vehicles. Here's the problem with that claim. My tractor was not parked on common area land. It was parked 40 feet inside my own property line, nowhere near the access road, nowhere near any shared space. I had the survey markers to prove it. I had photographs from just days earlier showing exactly where it sat. So when people ask me how this whole thing started, I always say the same thing. HOA Karen towed my tractor, and that was the single dumbest financial decision anyone in that neighborhood ever made, and I intended to make sure everyone knew it. I drove straight to the towing company's lot. I paid an infuriating release fee of $640 just to get my own equipment back, because apparently that's how towing works even when the tow itself was unauthorized. The tow driver, to his credit, seemed uncomfortable the whole time and admitted that the HOA lady had directed him to a spot on a printed map that didn't match where my tractor had actually been. That was the moment I stopped being a patient neighbor and started being a very thorough one. The first thing I did was request the HOA's towing authorization paperwork through a formal written demand. Karen Whitfield's response was 3 sentences long and included the phrase, "The board reserves the right to maintain neighborhood standards on all adjacent frontage." I want you to notice that word, adjacent. Not owned, not governed, adjacent. Even in her own excuse, she was admitting my land wasn't actually under HOA control. She just didn't think that mattered. I spent the next several days doing something I probably should have done years earlier. I pulled the original plat maps from the county recorder's office. I requested a certified copy of the easement agreement from 1987. I hired a land surveyor to restake my property boundaries with fresh, unmistakable markers. And I sat down with a real estate attorney who specialized in easement law. What we found confirmed everything my closing attorney had flagged years before, and then some. The 1987 easement agreement granted Willow Creek Estates developer, not the HOA, the original developer, a right-of-way for road access across that 50-foot strip of my land. That right-of-way had specific conditions attached to it, conditions I hadn't paid much attention to before because I'd never had a reason to. One condition stated that the easement holder was responsible for maintaining the roadway surface. Another stated that the easement could be suspended if the easement holder or their agents caused damage to the underlying property or interfered with the landowner's reasonable use of adjacent land. My attorney's eyes lit up when she read that clause. Towing my tractor, a legally parked piece of equipment sitting well within my own property lines, based on a bogus claim about common area land, was, in her professional opinion, a textbook example of the HOA interfering with my reasonable use of my own property. But here's the part that really mattered. The 1987 developer who signed that original easement agreement had dissolved as a company nearly 15 years ago. Under the terms of the agreement, when the original grantee ceased to exist as a legal entity, the easement rights were supposed to transfer to whatever homeowners association formally took over governance of the community, but only if that transfer was properly recorded with the county within a defined window. It never was. Nobody had ever filed the transfer paperwork. Not the developer's estate, not the original HOA board, not any board since. For 15 years, Willow Creek Estates had been using that access road under an easement that, legally speaking, no longer had a valid living grantee attached to it. In plain English, the HOA didn't actually have a clear legal right to use my land as their entrance road anymore. They'd been operating on inertia and assumption, not paperwork. I sat on this information for about a week, partly out of disbelief and partly because I wanted to be absolutely certain before I did anything. I had my attorney double, then triple, check the filing history. I had the county recorder's office confirm in writing that no transfer document existed anywhere in their system. I even reached out to a retired member of the original development company just to make sure I wasn't missing some private side agreement. There wasn't one. So I made a decision. HOA Karen towed my tractor off my own land based on a lie about jurisdiction she didn't actually have, and I was going to respond by reminding her, and the entire board, exactly whose land they'd been driving over for free for 15 years. My attorney drafted a formal notice. It was polite, professional, and absolutely devastating. It laid out the history of the easement, cited the specific clause about the lapse transfer, and formally notified the Willow Creek Estates HOA that, effective in 30 days, the easement allowing use of my land as an access road would be considered void due to lack of a valid recorded grantee. The notice offered the board an opportunity to resolve the issue through a new, properly negotiated easement agreement, one that would include a formal apology for the wrongful tow, reimbursement of my towing and release fees, and reasonable compensation for the years of unpermitted use and road maintenance I had personally provided at my own expense. I want to be clear that I wasn't trying to be cruel. I genuinely offered them a fair, reasonable off-ramp. All they had to do was own their mistake and negotiate in good faith. Karen Whitfield's response arrived 4 days later, hand-delivered by a very apologetic-looking board secretary. It was a single paragraph. It called my claims baseless, accused me of attempting to extort the community, and stated that the HOA's legal counsel would be handling any further correspondence. That was her second mistake. Her first was towing my tractor. Her second was assuming her legal counsel would find something my attorney hadn't already triple-checked. 30 days came and went. On day 31, with proper notice filed and posted as required by law, I did exactly what I said I would do. I had my surveyor place clearly marked, professionally installed barriers along the 50-foot easement strip, my property, leaving a narrow, clearly signed pedestrian walkway for emergency access only, but closing the paved section to general vehicle traffic. I also filed formal notice with the county and with local emergency services, explaining the legal basis for the closure and confirming that alternate access still existed, though it required a significant detour. See, that's the detail people often forget when they hear this story. Willow Creek Estates did technically have a second entrance, a narrow service road on the opposite side of the development, originally intended for utility trucks and emergency vehicles. It was unpaved, poorly maintained, and nowhere near capable of handling the daily traffic of nearly 200 homes. But it existed, which meant I wasn't cutting anyone off entirely. I was simply, and completely legally, reclaiming my own property from an association that had ignored basic paperwork for over a decade, and then decided the appropriate way to treat a good-faith neighbor was to tow his equipment off his own land. In the days leading up to the closure, I made sure to do everything by the book, because I knew this story would eventually get picked apart by people looking for a reason to say I was the villain. I sent certified letters to every board member individually, not just to Karen Whitfield. I posted the legal notice at the entrance itself, in a clear plastic sleeve, for the full 30 days, exactly as required. I even called the local sheriff's department ahead of time to explain what was happening, so that if anyone called in a panic on the day of the closure, the dispatchers would already understand the situation and could reassure people rather than escalate it. I also want to mention that during those 30 days, I wasn't sitting around gloating. I genuinely hoped the HOA would come back to the table. I left 2 voicemails for the board treasurer, a woman named Diane who had always struck me as reasonable, just to see if there was any appetite for a quiet resolution before things became public. Diane called me back, off the record, and admitted that Karen Whitfield had never actually brought my written notice to a full board vote. She had handled the response herself, without consulting the rest of the board, and simply told everyone else that the neighbor was being difficult. That was the moment I realized this wasn't really an HOA problem. It was a Karen problem that the rest of the HOA hadn't even been given the chance to weigh in on. That detail mattered a lot once the story became public because it meant the other board members were just as blindsided as everyone else when the entrance actually closed. The morning the barriers went up, I got what I can only describe as a front row seat to chaos. I watched from my porch as car after car slowed down, confused, at what used to be the entrance to Willow Creek Estates. Some people got out and read the posted legal notice. Others called the HOA office, which apparently had no idea how to respond, because Karen Whitfield hadn't told anyone on the board that the 30-day notice period had actually expired. By 9 in the morning, there was a line of cars trying to figure out how to reach the service road on the other side of the neighborhood. By noon, the local news had picked up the story, because apparently a resident live-streamed the confusion with the caption, "HOA Karen towed my tractor, so I legally shut down their entire entrance." And it spread faster than anyone expected. A local news van showed up around 1 in the afternoon, and I agreed to give a short, calm statement, mostly because I didn't want the situation to be defined by rumors instead of facts. I kept it simple. I explained that I wasn't trying to punish my neighbors, that I had given the HOA 30 days of proper legal notice, and that the entrance would reopen the moment the board negotiated a fair, properly documented easement. I made a point of not mentioning Karen Whitfield by name on camera, even though half the neighborhood was already saying it for me in the comments under the news station's post. I didn't need to name her. The paperwork did that for me. Not everyone in the neighborhood was upset with me either. A surprising number of residents actually stopped by my property that first afternoon, not to complain, but to ask questions. A retired school teacher named Mrs. Doyle told me she'd been fighting Karen Whitfield over an unrelated fence violation for months and was thrilled to see someone finally push back with something more effective than a strongly worded email. A young couple with a newborn baby were less thrilled, understandably, since the detour added real time to their daily commute, and I made sure to apologize to them directly and explain that I was working as fast as I could to get things resolved. I meant that. I never wanted innocent families caught in the middle of a fight that started because someone towed my tractor off my own land. I didn't do any of this for attention. I did it because I had exhausted every reasonable, quiet option first. But I won't pretend I didn't feel a certain satisfaction watching an HOA that had spent years fining people over garden gnomes suddenly discover what it felt like to deal with a real consequence. The HOA called an emergency board meeting that same evening. I was invited, somewhat ironically, as a concerned party. I brought my attorney. Karen Whitfield brought a defensive posture and very little actual legal preparation. Her hired counsel, to his credit, seemed to understand within the first 10 minutes that they were in serious trouble. He pulled Karen aside twice during the meeting and both times she came back looking a little paler. The board's own attorney eventually confirmed, in front of the entire room, that the county records showed no valid transfer of the original easement, that the 30-day notice had been properly filed and posted, and that from a legal standpoint, my closure of the entrance was fully within my rights as the underlying property owner. That's when the tone in the room shifted from defensive to desperate. Several homeowners who had nothing to do with the original tractor incident spoke up, understandably frustrated that they were now dealing with a 20-minute detour to get to work because of a fight they weren't part of. I told them honestly, and I meant every word, that I had no interest in punishing 200 families for the actions of one HOA president. I said I was fully willing to reopen the entrance the moment the board agreed to a fair, properly recorded easement agreement and addressed the original wrongful tow. Karen tried, one more time, to argue that the towing had been justified because my tractor was an eyesore. Her own board members visibly cringed. One of them, a retired engineer named Mr. Aldis, who had been quiet most of the meeting, finally spoke up and said something I'll never forget. He said the board hadn't hired Karen to invent new rules for land she didn't govern, and that the moment she authorized a tow on private property outside the HOA's boundary, she'd created this entire mess herself. There was one more moment from that meeting worth mentioning. Near the end, before the vote, Karen Whitfield made a final attempt to salvage her position by suggesting the board simply ignore the legal notice and wait me out, arguing that I would eventually cave under community pressure and reopen the entrance out of guilt. The board's attorney immediately shut that idea down, explaining, in front of everyone, that continuing to encourage residents to use a closed private road without a valid easement could expose the HOA to further liability, and that any additional delay would only weaken their negotiating position. You could see the exact moment the rest of the board stopped listening to Karen Whitfield and started looking at their attorney instead. By the end of that meeting, the board voted 5-2 to formally apologize, reimburse my towing costs, and authorize their attorney to negotiate a new, fully compliant easement agreement with fair compensation for continued road access. Karen Whitfield was among the 2 dissenting votes. 2 weeks later, at the board's next scheduled election, she wasn't dissenting anymore because she wasn't on the board at all. She didn't even finish out her term. She resigned before the recall petition that was already circulating could force the issue. The new easement agreement took about 6 weeks to finalize. It was fair to everyone. The HOA gained clear, properly recorded, permanent legal access to the road. I received fair annual compensation for the ongoing use of my land, reimbursement for my towing expenses, a formal written apology on HOA letterhead, and, this part still makes me smile, an official amendment to the community bylaws clarifying that HOA authority does not extend to properties outside the association's recorded boundary, regardless of visibility from a shared road. I moved my barriers the day the new agreement was signed, exactly as I promised I would. The entrance reopened. Life in Willow Creek Estates mostly went back to normal, minus one HOA president and plus one very well-documented cautionary tale about checking your paperwork before you start towing your neighbor's equipment. People sometimes ask me if I regret how far things escalated. Honestly, I don't. I gave that HOA every reasonable opportunity to make things right quietly. I offered a fair resolution before I ever touched a single barrier. It was only after they dismissed my legitimate legal claim as extortion that I decided to use the leverage I actually had. My tractor is back in my field, right where it's always belonged, well within my own property line. I still plow the road every winter, though now I do it under a properly signed contract instead of out of neighborly goodwill. And every so often, when a new resident moves into Willow Creek Estates and hears the story for the first time, someone points toward my property and says, "That's the guy. HOA Karen towed his tractor, and he legally shut down their entire entrance." It's become something of a local legend at this point, and I'll admit, I don't mind that one bit. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not really about tractors or towing or even HOAs specifically. It's about knowing exactly what you own, understanding the paperwork behind it, and never assuming that just because something has always been done a certain way, it's actually being done legally. Karen Whitfield assumed authority she never had. She assumed a tow truck could substitute for actual jurisdiction. And in the end, all of that assumption cost her neighborhood a resignation, a new easement negotiation, and a story that will probably be told at Willow Creek Estates board meetings for years to come. As for me, I just keep doing what I've always done, running my land, minding my own business, and making absolutely sure that if anyone ever comes looking to push me around again, I've already got the paperwork to push back a whole lot harder.